of the Ukrainian Institute of Politics, Nicholas Nagent, former BBC editor in London, Tatiana Kukhareva, senior journalist, joining us from Moscow, and Dr. Richard Benkin, commentator and journalist, joining us from Chicago. Thank you to all of you for joining me on this discussion. Coming to you first, Nicholas Nagent. You know, I mean, we've already, in fact, seen a reaction coming in from Volodymyr Zelensky on this, and that has, in fact, been seen as the biggest hurdle in terms of a peace plan, if at all, can be achieved through this US-Russia talks. What's your reaction to the fact that Ukraine has been left out, and do you think there can be any real progress achieved with a Ukraine representative not being at the table during these discussions?
Well, I will express to you the skepticism that is the prevailing view in European capitals. How can peace talks begin when one of the participants isn't there? That's the negative side, and we've seen reactions from European leaders who frankly don't know where this process is going. But to put a more positive gloss on it, something's moving. Something's moving, and there's talk of peace. And that, of course, has to be positive. One shouldn't be negative about that. And I think, again, giving you a European view, what we now are clear about is that Russia is keen to find an end to the war. And that's something we weren't at all sure about. You know, the prevailing view was that Russia is doing rather well, expects to win, and has no reason to stop fighting. But I think this meeting in Riyadh has demonstrated that Russia is serious about finding a way to end the war, possibly because it wants sanctions to be lifted. I won't question the motives, but that is the biggest positive thing to come out of this meeting as far as I can see.
Ruslan Botnik, if I can get you in on this, there's no date set yet for a high-level team. We have already seen a strong reaction in a way coming in from Volodymyr Zelensky. But still, do you see today's development as some sort of a progress, as Nicholas there was pointing out?
I agree with my colleagues that now we have some move to the peace maybe, and even this move could lead us to the decreasing the level of the hostilities on Ukrainian front. So it's in any case, it's very important, but it is still very far away from the concrete exact peace plan or schedule or calendar, and it still there are still a very much different obstacles will be on the way, concrete obstacles to achieve the agreement. So then the sharp reaction of Ukraine, it's not because the Ukraine is absent on this stage of negotiation, but because Ukrainian interests are not taken into account because of the size of this conflict during this negotiation. So it's a big problem. But in any case, of course, United States and Russia are able to achieve agreement on this conflict, but they are not able to fulfill this agreement without Ukraine and without the European Union.
Right, they will not be able to fulfill the agreement without Ukraine's participation. Tatiana Kukhareva, how do you respond? Let's begin with that, to what Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky had to say, that the European Union and Ukraine, of course, very significantly, cannot be left out of the discussions if peace has to be achieved in the region.
Well, Tanima, I think that this is, my response would be that karma is a very kind of cruel lady in this respect, because Volodymyr Zelensky was very comfortable with Russia not being part of the peace conversation. And now he can finally appreciate how, kind of reap the fruits of his own making. In the meantime, to respond to Mr. Botnik's remarks, I believe that this meeting, which was the first meeting, yes, not on the highest level, but on quite a high level, in fact, very much reflects the interest of Ukraine, as in the Ukrainian people. The Ukrainian people that need a stop to war. What it doesn't represent is the interest of the Ukrainian current leadership. But to think of it very pragmatically, I think that Russia and the US can very much deliver on any sort of agreement that comes out of this, because without the US support and without the US taxpayer dollars pouring into this conflict, Ukraine will simply run out of arms. And I don't need to remind Mr. Bortnik what happens when Ukraine runs out of ammunition. That's a very, very simple picture. So in that respect, the US is very much a serious contributor to any sort of outcome of this conflict.
All right, let me go across to Dr. Richard Benkin. Dr. Benkin, you heard all the sides so far. We know that the peace process, in a way, at least talks about it, had in fact started with Donald Trump, even before he took over as the US president for the second time around. He has in fact set the ball rolling, at least in terms of talking to both sides, considering his previous connections with Russian President Vladimir Putin. But do you see this as posturing by Donald Trump? It was one of his campaign promises to end both the wars, both the ongoing wars. But is he looking at a real settlement of the issue, or he seems to be like a man in a hurry, trying to get an edge or trying to reestablish US's authority as especially over some of the top geopolitical issues of the day? But what, according to you, is the real agenda, or what is Trump's target when it comes to these talks?
Well, thank you for having me on. I think if we've learned anything within the past month, is certainly President Donald Trump is very aware of optics and how things play to the wider audience. But we've also learned that he will do what he says he's going to do. So I think this is a real effort. However, I believe one of the other problems we have is people are getting all wound up about what's going on right now, and I think that's a mistake. If you look at the history of peace talks, the first part of them involves a lot of posturing, logistics, things like that. Beyond that, the meetings yesterday in Riyadh, both the Russians and the Americans kind of made it clear that this was more about a thaw in US-Russia relations than about the war itself. Now, peace talks will follow, and Secretary of State Rubio has made it clear on several occasions that we're not going to have any kind of resolution that all the parties aren't okay with. But I believe this first part is about that thaw in US-Russia relationships. And now, first of all, I think we can all sleep a little easier if the world's two largest nuclear powers are actually talking to each other instead of throwing stones at one another. Secondly, I think that there are two significant geopolitical events that are happening right now that certainly turn the previous world order on its head. And that's this. First of all, with the thaw in US-Russia relationship comes the first real opportunity for Donald Trump, and this is also part of what he talked about, to break that strong anti-democratic, anti-US, anti-Western coalition that came together over the last several years, of which Russia was a very important part. And this gives the world an opportunity to say, well, maybe we don't have to have those two coalitions fighting with one another. But the second thing is, and I've actually been advising people for years, that the future of the United States is not Europe. The future of the United States is Asia. And of course, with my experience, I look primarily at India and Israel. However, what we're seeing right now is that in these initial talks, President Trump is very clear that the EU is kind of being sidelined from that. Oh, eventually, if they're going to be expected to spend their money and provide troops, they're going to have to be involved. But right now, I think what we're hearing from President Trump and his people on this is that we can no longer understand a world where Europe is the center of it. where
Okay.
Europe is the major player and where Europe has to be considered significant in all these discussions, but in fact, there might be other players.
Right. Nicholas Nugent, you heard what Dr. Benkin had to say. If we look at the Russian side, that was, of course, about the intentions as far as the US delegation is concerned. But if we look at the Russian side, you know, on the one hand, they are saying there's a mutual desire to find solutions. On the other hand, there's also this rhetoric coming out from the Russian delegation that if European Union is considering sending troops to the Ukraine, that's going to be unacceptable. So do you feel, yes, there is progress in terms of actually US and Russia talking about finding a solution, but the fact that one of the key parties in this conflict is, you know, making these comments even on a day like today, do you believe that Russia is actually seeking an end to the war in a, you know, in a timeline that can be drawn out within this year?
Well, I will only say to that specific question, I hope so. I can't say more than that. But responding to Dr. Benkin, and I don't disagree with anything he said, I would add to my list of positives the fact that this is a US-Russia thaw. Perhaps that should have been top of my list, even before thinking about peace in Ukraine. The fact that the two strongest nuclear powers, as Dr. Benkin put it, are talking to each other is surely progress. But I would slightly qualify what he went on to say when he talked about breaking the alliance on the other side, as it were. I think he was referring to the de facto relationship or warmth, no, more than that. Alliance, I don't think is too strong a word, between Russia and China, and perhaps Iran and North Korea might also be on his list. Okay, maybe that's the case, but what about the other side? You know, Russia is believed to be trying to break the relationship on the Western side, the so-called Western alliance. And what worries Europeans is that they seem to be succeeding by the events of the last few days. In other words, NATO is not the strong protector of peace in Europe that we believed it was. And I speak as a European. NATO's been in existence all my life, and it has been the guarantor of peace in Europe. Dr. Benkin may be quite right by saying America's future lies in Asia rather than in Europe, but where does that leave Europe? Do we now belong to a headless alliance that no longer has the strength to protect European nations in the way that we once thought? That's what worries Europeans, I have to say, the weakening, the apparent weakening of NATO. I hope I'm wrong there. So whilst I can agree about what's going on, you know, the détente between the United States and Russia is clearly very, very positive in world affairs. I'm not quite so sure about part two, about where that leaves the traditional lineups on both sides.
Right. Let me go to Tatiana before I go back to Ruslan. Tatiana, do you see or foresee an engagement by the European nations or Ukraine in these negotiations very soon? They were absent from the meetings today, but don't you think that there can be a lot of progress achieved if we include the Ukrainian representatives as well as the EU as part of these negotiations?
Well, I do believe that, you know, Ukraine is probably going to be part of the negotiations when we actually get to some sort of an active part of said negotiations, probably. That does depend on the two parties that we're meeting today and their will to accept Vladimir Zelensky, especially taking into account the last comments that he has been making, including the kind of trying to stand up to Donald Trump on those resource agreements and everything else, and trying to kind of include himself into that dent, you know, that my colleagues have been talking about between the US and European Union in order to kind of stimulate the Europeans to pay more for the great Ukrainian cause, so to speak. However, in terms of Europe, you know, that's a very interesting question. Is Europe a part of this conflict? Yes, it is. It is a minor part because it has been sending money. However, not even closely comparable to what the US has been sending. The previous administration outdid itself. So it is a minor player. And if we step aside from this, the beloved idea of left-wing politicians and commentators in Europe is that if you don't stop Putin, then he's going to go all the way. Probably not to Great Britain because, why swim?
Right.
It's too much of an effort. So if we step away from that idea that you're facing another invasion, then there is no place for Europe.
Okay.
Europe is not part of this. Ukraine is not and will not in the foreseeable future be a part of the European Union. And it's not part of NATO. And Donald Trump was adamant that it's not going to be part of NATO. So Europe is there on its own accord, but it doesn't mean that it needs to be included.
So the Russian delegation did say today that they do not have an objection to Ukraine joining the EU. But let's quickly listen in. We have the soundbite ready of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Let's listen into that before I come back to Ruslan for his final thoughts.
Росія поставила ультиматум в цей момент. Зменшення кількості Збройних сил України, визнання окупованих територій України територіями Росії, хотіли поставити керівництво держави проросійське, щоб воно повністю було в вертикалі Путіна. І у мене таке враження, що зараз відбуваються якісь перемовини, і вони з таким самим настроєм відбуваються. Але вони відбуваються між представниками Росії і представниками Сполучених Штатів Америки.
Right, we have very less time left on the show. Ruslan Botnick, you have the final word.
Friends, I think all people in the world are interested in the peace, and in every negotiation it could be very good for my people also. But I think we'll achieve a lot of obstacles on this way, and we are now only in a preliminary stage of this negotiation. It's too early to say what will be the end, what will be the result in this negotiation. So let's see.
Okay, Ruslan Botnick, Nicholas Nugent, Tatiana Kukareva, and Dr. Richard Benkin, thank you so much for joining me for this show. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but we'll of course continue our focus on this developing international story. But for the moment, we'll head into a short break. Coming up on the other side, left, right, and center with my colleague Ankit Tyagi.
Hello, Moto.
Motorola Edge 50 Pro, world's first AI-powered pro-grade camera.
I've been reporting on all issues, big and small, from Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, rest of South India, bringing you all the action, all that you need to know, all that you want to know.
The energy of Maximum City is infectious. I bring in that energy in our news coverage from financial capital, Mumbai.
Covering from the southernmost part of India over the last 23 years, I bring in-depth and 360-degree coverage from the Dravidian heartland.
The land of Mishti is also known for its bitter politics. I have seen much water flow under the Howrah Bridge.